That quiet moment when everything around you seems to keep moving, but something inside you has stopped. A stillness, not peace, not calm. A strange silence that feels more like a scream with no sound. You look for explanations. You search your thoughts. You ask yourself, why does this ache feel so real, as if I can't even name it? This is where religion begins. Not in temples, not in sermons. It begins in that ache. It begins in the wound. William James, long before modern psychology tried to sterilize the human soul, said what no one wanted to admit. The religious experience is born from pain, not from logic, not from moral perfection. From pain, raw, personal, unfiltered. He called it the sick soul. The person who doesn't just feel sadness or fear, but feels the world itself as broken, as if there's something fundamentally wrong, not only out there, but in here, inside. A fracture, a split, a void that doesn't go away, no matter how many books you read, no matter how much you distract yourself. That's where God waits. Not above, not far, but in the silence behind the scream. Modern religion often tries to clean this up, tries to make spirituality polite, structured, digestible. But Jesus never showed up in clean places. He didn't preach inside marble halls. He touched bleeding skin. He sat in the dirt. He walked through chaos and called out the ones who were already breaking. The ones whose hearts were too tired to pretend anymore. And maybe that's you. Maybe your faith never fit into the nice little boxes they gave you. Maybe you felt that you weren't allowed to talk about the questions that wake you up at 3 a.m. Maybe they told you God only comes to the righteous, but all you had left were the pieces of someone who used to believe. And here's the truth that no one tells you. God begins where your answers end. William James didn't believe in God because it made logical sense. He didn't build a case for faith in the courtroom of philosophy. He felt it. He saw it transform broken people. He studied hundreds of lives and saw a pattern. Those who truly encountered something divine were those who had nothing else left. They weren't philosophers. They weren't saints. They were shattered human beings, gasping for breath under the weight of their own existence. And something came to them. Something unexplainable. And it stayed, and it changed them. This isn't the kind of story that fits on Instagram quotes or gets preached in megachurches. This is the kind of faith that bleeds, because it's one thing to believe in a distant idea of God. It's another to feel Him when you're lying on the bathroom floor, trying to remember what it felt like to be whole. It's one thing to memorize verses. It's another to feel like someone heard you when you said, "I can't do this anymore." That's when faith is real. That's when religion stops being theory and starts becoming breath, not something you study, something you survive with. James believed in the practical power of belief. If a belief could carry you through darkness, it didn't matter whether it could be proven. What mattered was that it held you when nothing else could. So what if we've been asking the wrong question all along? Have you ever felt something you couldn't explain, but deep down you knew it changed you? Share your story in the comments. Someone out there might need to hear it. And if this message spoke to you, subscribe to the channel. There's more on the way. What if faith isn't something we're supposed to understand, but something we're supposed to feel when everything else goes silent? There's a story James often referred to, not from scripture, but from lived experience. A man on the edge of madness, lost in existential despair, found himself unable to sleep. Night after night, the weight of meaninglessness pressed on his chest like a stone, until one night, in complete stillness, he felt something. Not a voice, not a vision, just a presence, a warmth, a knowing. He never knew how to describe it. He only knew he wasn't alone anymore. He lived, not because he found answers, but because something felt true in the deepest part of him, and that was enough. Isn't that what most of us want? Not a God we can explain, but a God who shows up when we're dying inside. William James wasn't interested in building systems of theology. He wanted to understand why people who had no hope suddenly began to live again, Why people on the edge of suicide, on the edge of breakdown, on the edge of total collapse, suddenly found light. What was that? Where did it come from? And every time he traced it, every time he pulled the thread, it always led back to the same place, a moment of pure, living faith, beyond thought, beyond tradition, beyond reason. That's what Jesus offered, not explanation, presence. He didn't tell people to solve their sins. He walked with them while they were still broken. He didn't demand they understand the mystery. He simply said, "Follow me." And maybe he's saying that to you right now, not as a preacher, not as a distant deity, but as the only voice left in the room when everything else is falling apart. You're not supposed to get it, you're supposed to feel it. That's where it starts. And the moment you let go of trying to control it all, that might just be the moment something sacred finally reaches in. Because the ache you carry may not be a flaw. It may be a doorway. And what waits on the other side is something you were never meant to explain, only to feel. And just as that thought begins to settle, something darker stirs underneath, because not every feeling leads to God. Some lead to madness, some to something else entirely. But that's for what comes next. It's a strange thing, how belief can keep a person alive. Not belief in a theory, not in a book, not even in a name, but in something felt, a pulse beneath the skin, a whisper in the dark, the sense that maybe, just maybe, you're not entirely alone in this. William James never said that religion should be provable. He didn't argue that faith should be logically defendable in the way science demands. Instead, he asked a much simpler, much more human question. Does it help you live? Because for James, that was the core of everything. The value of a belief wasn't found in its neatness or its academic soundness, but in its practical impact on the soul. That's the kind of belief that matters. Not what you say in church, not what you write in a theology paper, but what keeps you from giving up when your mind is collapsing. Picture someone who's drowning, not in water, but in thoughts, the kind that circle endlessly at 2 a.m. Thoughts about failure, emptiness, regret, meaninglessness. They're not asking for a lecture on theology. They don't want a philosophical treatise. They want one thing, a reason not to disappear. And sometimes that reason isn't a perfectly framed sentence. Sometimes it's just one word, Jesus. Even if they can't explain why that name matters, even if they can't quote a single verse, even if they're full of doubt and shame and confusion, something about that name anchors them for one more night. James saw this again and again. He documented cases, real people, real stories, where the experience of believing in God, or more precisely, feeling God, became the tipping point between despair and survival. One story in particular stood out to him. A man on the edge of suicide, isolated and numb, had decided that there was no more point in living. But before ending his life, he whispered a half-forgotten prayer his grandmother used to say. He didn't even believe it. He said it sarcastically, bitterly. But something happened. He felt warmth in his chest. He started to cry, not from sadness, but from a strange relief. A crack had opened in the wall. He didn't know how to describe it. He just knew something had shifted. He didn't die that night, and he never did. Not because he found answers, but because something unseen gave him strength. Because faith, not the clean, polished kind, but the messy, desperate, trembling kind, worked. That was all James needed to know. He wasn't trying to protect religion from skepticism. He welcomed doubt. But he knew that when a belief has the power to pull someone back from the edge, that belief has value. Not theoretical, not academic, but existential. And maybe this is why Jesus never insisted people understand him. He healed. He listened. He sat at tables with sinners. He touched people others wouldn't even look at. He didn't offer proofs. He offered himself. It's strange how we've twisted this in modern times. We think belief has to be neat, that faith must come with clarity. But in reality, most of us are just trying to get through the day. And sometimes belief isn't born out of knowledge. It's born out of collapse. It's in those moments when everything inside you feels like it's unraveling, that something ancient and sacred breaks through. Not like lightning, more like a whisper. Something that says, I see you, and you don't need to understand where it comes from. You just need to know it's real. This is where James was so different from the rest. He didn't treat God like an idea. He treated God like a force, a presence, a living experience that arrives when you've exhausted everything else. He talked about the will to believe, the strange ability we have to choose faith, not because we're certain, but because we have to. Because the alternative is a kind of inner death, and in choosing faith, something unexpected happens. You don't just survive. You begin to feel alive again. For some, that will to believe starts small, a single word, a candle lit in a dark room, a feeling that maybe the darkness won't win this time. And that's all it takes. Because once something works, once something holds, even when everything else has failed, you start to trust it, not like you trust a fact, but like you trust your own breath. It becomes part of you. This is the kind of belief Jesus invited people into, a belief you walk with, bleed with, cry with. It wasn't about repeating doctrines. It was about following him through the dirt, the pain, the silence, and discovering in that walk that your soul was still alive. There are so many people right now, maybe even you, who aren't looking for a system to belong to. They're looking for something real to keep them standing, something that will meet them in their pain, not try to explain it away. William James believed that kind of spirituality was the only kind worth having. One that touches real suffering, one that speaks to the human heart when nothing else can, one that doesn't promise to fix everything, but promises to be with you in everything. That's the kind of Jesus James would recognize, not the Jesus of polished sermons, but the Jesus who knelt in the dirt, the Jesus who touched open wounds, the Jesus who simply said, "Come with me." And maybe that's the invitation still being whispered tonight. Not believe or burn, not understand everything, just come with me. And here's the part most people miss. The power of that invitation is not in its explanation. It's in how it feels when you hear it. Because something inside you knows, even if your brain can't explain it, that he means it. And when that moment comes, when your heart recognizes a voice it forgot it knew, what do?
Go.
You step forward, even in the dark, even if you're trembling, because something stronger than reason has taken hold. And it's carrying you somewhere you never expected. But where? That question is what comes next. There's a moment many people don't talk about, not because it's rare, but because it's hard to explain. It might happen in a room full of people where suddenly you feel like time has slowed and the noise disappears. It might happen in the middle of a breakdown with tears soaking your pillow. Or it might come in total stillness when you're sitting in your car, engine off, staring at nothing, and something shifts. You can't describe it, you can't prove it, you can't even recreate it, but it feels real. That's the experience William James was obsessed with. He didn't care for religious systems built on rigid dogmas. He cared about what actually happened inside a person's soul. He studied people who had undergone profound spiritual experiences, and not one of them said, "I finally understood God." What they said was, "I felt something that changed me." James called these moments mystical experiences. They didn't come from sermons or textbooks. They weren't always invited, but when they came, they left marks, deep ones. There are 4 traits that James used to describe these experiences: ineffability, noetic quality, transience, and passivity. Don't let the academic language fool you. These aren't sterile concepts. They describe something most people have felt, but never dared to name. Ineffability. You can't explain what happened. You try, but the words feel too small. You say things like, "It felt like peace," or "It was like I wasn't alone," or "I just knew." But deep down, you know those words don't come close. no ethic quality. It felt like knowing, not intellectual knowing, but soul knowing. Like something ancient inside you had been touched, as if a door opened, not out there, but within, and you saw something you didn't know you needed to see. Transience. It didn't last. A few seconds, a minute, maybe longer, but it slipped away. And yet, it didn't. Because even though the moment passed, you weren't the same anymore. Passivity. You didn't choose it. You didn't cause it. It came to you. Like a wave. Like a presence. Like something other that stepped into your ordinary life and whispered, "I'm here." Most people who have these experiences never talk about them. Why? Because they're afraid of sounding crazy. They don't want to be labeled. They don't want their sacred moment reduced to a psychological episode or a chemical glitch. But William James, he validated them. He said, "These moments matter, not because they prove something external, but because they awaken something internal. They bring meaning, comfort, clarity, transformation." And often, these are the moments when people feel closest to Jesus, not during a hymn, not during a church ritual, but during silence, desperation, crisis. It's not that Jesus shows up only in suffering, it's that we become quiet enough in suffering to notice him. There's a woman James once mentioned in his lectures, anonymous, lost in grief, who sat on her bedroom floor night after her child died. No priest, no friend, no book could reach her. She was alone in the blackness of it all. But then one night the air changed. She described it like a soft presence in the room. Not cold, not warm, just there. She felt arms around her. Invisible, yes, but real. And she began to breathe again. Not perfectly, not easily, but she breathed. That was the moment her life turned. Was it psychological? Maybe. But to her, it was God. And that made all the difference. James didn't try to argue with that. He didn't try to diagnose it. He did something radical. He believed her. What was the moment you felt most alone, and yet something made you stay? Drop it in the comments. Sometimes your pain is someone else's reminder to keep going. If this resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe. You're not walking this path alone, because here's the truth. Our world is starved for belief, but drowning in analysis. We dissect everything. We want proof before peace. But spiritual experiences don't play by those rules. They aren't here to fit in boxes. They're here to wake us up. How many people have felt something holy and silenced it out of fear? How many have brushed it off, said, "It's just my imagination," when maybe, just maybe, it was the most real thing they'd ever touched? Jesus never asked for us to analyze him. He asked us to follow him. And for many, that following begins in a mystical moment that changes everything. It could be standing under the stars when you suddenly feel small and at the same time deeply seen. It could be hearing a voice, not in your ears but in your chest, saying, "You're not alone." It could be holding a stranger's hand in a hospital room and feeling the air grow still, sacred. These moments are invitations, not demands, not proofs, but invitations. And William James believed that the only mistake we can make with them is to ignore them. Because while the moment may be fleeting, its effects are not. People have changed the course of their lives because of one strange encounter they couldn't explain. People have left behind addiction, hatred, despair, not because someone convinced them with logic, but because something sacred reached out and touched them when they weren't even looking. And that is something no textbook can account for. The truth is, some of the most powerful spiritual awakenings don't come when you're looking for them. They come when you've let go, when the noise dies, when you stop trying to hold yourself together. That's when the presence moves in. And maybe that's what Jesus meant when he said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit," not because poverty is noble, but because when you're emptied, there's finally space for something holy to enter. So here's the question James would ask. Have you ever had a moment like that? one you never talk about, one you carry inside like a secret, one that keeps you from fully giving up even when everything else falls apart? If you have, you're not alone. If you haven't, maybe you're closer than you think, because these moments don't ask for perfection. They don't require belief first. Sometimes they come to the most broken. Sometimes to those who don't believe at all. And when they do, they leave behind a hunger, a sacred restlessness, a sense that something more is out there, and that hunger is what leads to what comes next. Somewhere along the line, something went wrong. Faith, once a living, breathing experience, raw, messy, holy, got packaged, organized, cleaned up. It turned into a system, rules, expectations, doctrine. It became a club you had to qualify for, with statements to memorize and questions you weren't allowed to ask. And in the middle of all that, something got lost. William James saw it coming, long before deconstruction was a trend. Before people started walking away from churches in waves, James warned about what happens when faith becomes too intellectual, when it stops being something felt and turns into something you're just supposed to think about. He knew that when belief becomes rigid, when it demands explanation before experience, when it elevates certainty over transformation, something sacred dies. And you can feel that death in people. You see it in their tired eyes when they say, "I go to church, but I don't feel anything anymore." You hear it in their voices when they whisper, "I still believe, I think, but it doesn't feel real." You sense it when someone recites a verse like a robot, not because it brings them life, but because they've been trained to say it. This is the difference between knowing about God and actually encountering God. One fills your head, the other changes your soul. Jesus never invited people to memorize him. He invited them to walk with him, to eat with him, to touch the hem of his robe. His presence didn't require a theology degree. It just required an open heart, even a broken one. And that's the part so many modern expressions of religion miss. They think if you can just explain things better, if you can win the argument, if you can quote the right verse at the right time, people will believe. But that's not how transformation works, because belief, real belief, is not a conclusion. It's a collision between the divine and your deepest wounds, a sacred interruption that rewrites your reality. And that has almost nothing to do with doctrinal accuracy. James wrote extensively about how religious institutions tend to focus on form over essence. They want order, predictability, control. But the actual experience of the sacred? It refuses to be caged. It shows up in strange places, in broken people, in chaotic moments, in things that don't make sense. That's why Jesus kept getting in trouble with the religious leaders of his day. He healed on the Sabbath. He touched the untouchables. He forgave people before they repented. He told stories that didn't always make sense, but felt true. He disrupted their carefully crafted structures because he wasn't interested in control. He was interested in transformation. And transformation doesn't start with answers. It starts with presence. James believed that when spirituality stops being an experience and becomes just an intellectual exercise, it loses its power. It becomes sterile, a form without fire, a shadow without light. He saw how systems, when left unchecked, become more obsessed with preserving themselves than actually helping people encounter the sacred. And when that happens, people start to suffocate. They feel like they have to perform, to say the right things, to hide their questions, to silence their doubt. But Jesus never rejected people for doubting. He met Thomas in his confusion. He wept with Mary before raising Lazarus. He let Peter fall apart and then called him back in with a single question. Do you love me? Not, do you understand me? Not, do you agree with everything I taught? Just, do you love me? That's the core of it all. And James would say, if your spiritual life isn't making you more alive, more honest, more present in your own skin, then maybe it's not really spiritual anymore. Maybe it's just performance. a script, a religion built to be admired, not inhabited, and that's dangerous. Because when faith becomes a script, people learn to fake it. They learn to smile while dying inside. They learn to speak the language of devotion while their soul is quietly slipping away. But deep down, you can always feel it, that ache, that tension between what you say you believe and what you actually feel. That quiet whisper that says, there has to be more than this. That whisper is holy. It's not rebellion. It's not failure. It's the beginning of a spiritual awakening. James called it the divided self, when the surface of your life no longer matches the truth underneath. And that inner split is where the real work begins. It's where the divine breaks in. It's where Jesus meets you, not in your polished self, but in your honest self. Not the version of you that knows the answers, the version of you that can't stop asking the questions. And maybe that's what you've been sensing lately. A restlessness, a quiet dissatisfaction with the way things have been. A hunger for something real, not rehearsed. A desire to feel God again, not just study Him. That desire is not a problem. It's an invitation. And if you follow it, if you stop trying to explain your way back into the light and instead feel your way there, you might find something waiting for you, something old, something wild, something sacred, and that something is what takes us to the edge of everything, where certainty ends and something deeper begins. Sometimes it's not the light that leads you to God. It's the darkness, it's the sleepless nights, the breathless anxiety, the feeling that everyone around you is speaking a language you forgot how to understand. It's the moment you look in the mirror and don't recognize your own eyes. The moment you sit in your car, long after you've turned off the ignition, not because you're going anywhere, but because you don't know how to walk through your front door feeling like this. William James called it the sick soul. The person who doesn't just experience pain, but who carries it like a second skin. Not just a season of sorrow, but an identity forged in it. And he believed, radically, unapologetically, that these souls were not defective. They were closer to the sacred. To James, the sick soul wasn't someone to fix. It was someone who had seen beneath the surface. Someone who no longer found comfort in shallow answers or easy slogans. Someone who realized that life, if faced honestly, hurts. That sometimes the deeper you feel, the more you break, but also the more you open. And it's in that cracked open space where something unexpected can happen. Because there are places inside you that joy will never reach, but Jesus will. He doesn't wait for you to be strong. He doesn't wait for your faith to be perfect. He doesn't wait for you to say the right words. He steps into the pain, into the mess, into the confusion, and he stays, not as an explanation, but as a presence. This is what makes the experience of the divine so real to people who suffer, not because suffering is noble, but because it strips away the noise, it silences the fake, it dissolves the illusion of control, and in that silence you begin to feel something ancient, something alive, not a God who watches from a distance, but a God who bleeds with you. James observed this in countless stories, people at the edge of mental collapse who didn't need theology. They needed presence, a whisper, a sense of being seen, a touch that came when no one else was around. And once they felt it, they didn't go back. Not to religion as usual, but to a quieter, more honest kind of faith. And that kind of faith changes everything. It doesn't fix your life overnight. It doesn't erase the pain, but it reframes it. It reminds you that your brokenness isn't something that disqualifies you from God. It might be the very reason He's reaching for you in the first place. Because Jesus never stood with the proud. He never gave gold stars to the polished and the perfect. He walked with the ones who had nothing left to offer, the ashamed, the cast out, the wrecked. And maybe you've felt that too. If this message hit home, comment just one word. Here, no explanations needed, just to show you felt it. That you're still standing. And if you're with us on this journey, subscribe now. Your presence here matters. Maybe in your worst moments, when everyone else pulled away, something didn't. Maybe you felt it in a deep breath you couldn't explain. Maybe in the way a song shattered you unexpectedly. Maybe in the look of a stranger who smiled at just the right time. Maybe it wasn't just a coincidence. Maybe it was the sacred finding you. Because there's a truth most people never tell you. You don't choose when God arrives. You just notice when he does. And often it's in the aftermath, in the stillness after the scream, in the morning after the panic, in the numb silence where your prayers feel like dust. But somehow, he's there. You may not feel him every day. You may doubt more than you believe. You may walk away and come back 1,000 times. But he stays, not in the way religion promised, in the way your soul secretly hoped was real. And if you've made it this far in this video, maybe something in you is aching for that kind of presence. Not a belief system, not a rule book, but a God who sees you, sits beside you in the dark, and doesn't flinch at your questions. You're not too far gone. You're not too broken. You're exactly where real faith begins. Because real faith doesn't start when you've figured it all out. It starts when you've fallen apart and still whisper, "Are you there?" And somewhere in the silence a voice answers, not always loudly, not always in words, but deeply, clearly, intimately. "Yes, I'm here. I've always been." That's the kind of faith William James spent his life exploring, not the loud, boastful kind, the quiet, trembling kind that saves lives, the kind that holds you when nothing else can. The kind that finds you in the dark, not to drag you into the light, but to sit beside you until your eyes adjust. So if this spoke to you, if something inside you stirred while watching, don't ignore it. Don't rush past it. Sit with it. Let it breathe. And if you feel alone right now, just remember, the ache you carry isn't proof that God left. It might be the proof that he just arrived. Thank you for watching, for feeling, for staying with me through this journey. You don't need to have all the answers. You don't even need to believe with certainty. You just need to know you are not alone. Until next time, keep listening to that quiet voice. It may be closer than you think.